Hi friends, welcome back for session 5 of our Writing Realistic Fiction unit. Today's work is going to take all of the brainstorming we've been doing, all of the character development we've been doing, and stick it into a planned story structure. Now, a thing that we know about authors is that they don't just sit down and write a perfect story out of the middle of nowhere. Authors spend a lot of time planning their stories, thinking about events that work and don't work, thinking about obstacles that might be getting in the way of our characters' desires and motivations. So today I want to teach you that as planning writers, we can use lots of different tools, story arcs, timelines, lists, other stories that we love, as mentors to help us plan and develop the perfect story before we begin writing. Okay, friends, let's talk about 5 different types of story arcs that you could use in your planning today. An author named Kurt Vonnegut compiled these 5 story arcs and explained them in the following ways. The first one he calls the man in whole. Basically, it starts off with a person, a character who has good fortune. He ends up in trouble, but ultimately the story ends on a positive note. The next story arc that Vonnegut talks about is the boy meets girl story arc. This is a little bit old school. Really, it can be any character who interacts or meets something spectacular, stupendous. Of course, though, that thing ends up going away or mishaps happen that take it away. Ultimately, however, in boy meets girl story arcs, the ending is good and they either get that thing back or they find out that their life is better in another way. The next story arc that Vonnegut talks about is the Cinderella story arc. The Cinderella story arc starts in ill fortune. It starts on a bad note, just like Cinderella does. However, slowly and surely, it gets to a high point, and we could think of this high point as Cinderella's ball. Of course, we know that the clock strikes midnight and immediately plunges her back into ill fortune. Luckily for Cinderella, though, her story ends infinitely better and only gets better and better as she goes on. The fourth type of story arc that Vonnegut discusses is the Kafka story arc. This is based off of another author named Franz Kafka, and most of Kafka's stories go from bad to worse. Again, we see the infinity sign representing that it just keeps going. Unfortunately for Kafka's stories, they end up going in the bad direction. Finally, Vonnegut talks about the Hamlet story arc. Hamlet is a play written by William Shakespeare, and the reason why you see no story arc at all on this post-it note is because Hamlet's story has a lot of different events that could be interpreted for the good or for the bad. For instance, his father dies. However, he comes back as a ghost. Is this good or is this bad? The ghost does tell him that his father was murdered and now he can be avenged. However, the murderer is Hamlet's uncle. Is this good or is this bad? Over and over throughout the story, events happen that you can't say are entirely good or are entirely bad. This is the Hamlet plotline, and in a lot of ways, it mimics true life. I want to show you how I use one of these in my own story about the neighbor who's riding back and forth on their bicycle. So I'm going to use the boy meets girl plotline, and I'm just going to copy it directly into my notebook. And I think that this story starts out pretty normally when she's washing the dishes. That was part of my character development boot camp, and it is actually a really nice scene that I developed that I'd like to use in my final story. I think her high is when she's sitting out on her porch and she's drinking coffee. That was a beautiful moment for my narrator. Would you pause right now and tell me what you think the low in this story would be? Pause for 2 minutes and brainstorm as many different lows as you possibly can that would fit into my story. Did your low match mine? Did you have a different one? You're now going to spend your work time exploring all of the different story arcs that might fit in your story. I just chose to show you this one right now, but I actually think that during my work time, I'm going to experiment with at least 2 other story arcs to see what events might happen in my story. It's always good to take different options and different routes and not just settle on the first thing that you try, because stories end up being a lot better the more that we work them. Friends, during your work time today, you're going to explore not only all the different story arcs that might take place during your story, but you also can try creating lists for all the different events that you want to include, or reading your favorite story, or watching your favorite television show or your favorite movie and mimicking the story arcs that those characters go through. Remember that when we're planning out our writing, there's no limit to how many different plans we can make. And in fact, the more plans that we make, the better brainstorming we've done. Let's take a second and review all that we've learned so far. Today, we learned to plot with tools. I showed you story arcs, but don't forget that you can use timelines, lists, or even mentor texts like your favorite TV shows, movies, or books. As you go off to your work time today, remember that you really want to be focusing on developing the best possible plan. The best possible plan is typically never your first. So spend some time writing a plan and revising the plan. It can only get better. Until next time, happy writing.